You really thought Dad would leave you anything, Michael? Everyone here knows he saw you as the family screw-up. My brother Daniel's words rang out across the crowded banquet hall, loud enough to slice through the low hum of conversations and the clinking of wine glasses. And I felt the laughter of distant cousins ripple like an aftershock, my mother's eyes flashing with that tight, brittle smile she always put on when conflict threatened to spill into public view, while across the long table my teenage daughter, Claire, sank in her chair as if she wanted to disappear, her fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan, and in that instant the shame burned hotter than the whiskey in my glass. Because the one person I never wanted to see me diminished like this was watching, and I could do nothing but sit frozen in the glow of crystal chandeliers and candlelight, with every gaze pressing against me like a jury waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. My fork suspended midair above a piece of overcooked prime rib. I no longer had the stomach to swallow. And the silence that followed his words stretched so long it felt like an indictment in itself. My name's Michael Carter. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in Dayton, Ohio. And though I've spent half my life grinding my way into middle management at an engineering firm that eats people alive and spits out their bones, it seems no matter how many late nights I've logged, no matter how many bills I've covered when others came up short, somehow I'm always the man branded as less, the shadow in the room beside my golden boy brother, who knows how to smile at the right times and whisper the right lies, and maybe he thinks he's clever, maybe the rest of them think this humiliation will leave me crawling, but what none of them know is that I've got something they can't take from me, a detail so small it slipped past all their scheming eyes. And when the time comes, it will change everything. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his tie loosened just enough to make him look casual in a way that still carried authority, and I wanted to slam my fist through the polished mahogany table and ask him what he ever built with his own hands, what he ever carried on his back besides entitlement, but instead, I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my teeth and said, "Funny, coming from a man who's never worked a day past 5. Though my voice betrayed the tremor underneath, and he smirked, savoring the performance, while my aunt cleared her throat and muttered something about how we should focus on celebrating Dad's memory, not tearing each other apart, though even her words carried the soft edge of agreement with him. Because in their eyes I'd always been the restless one, the risk-taker who left Ohio for a career that nearly drowned me in debt before I clawed my way back, and they only ever remembered the stumbles, not the times I landed on my feet. The waiter came by to refill glasses, and Daniel raised his in a mock toast to Michael. "Dad's greatest disappointment," he announced, and laughter rippled again, not from everyone, but enough that I felt it like stones thrown at my chest, and I caught the eyes of my daughter across the table, her lips parting as if to speak, but she stopped herself, and that cut deeper than the laughter because it meant she believed the weight of his words. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to focus on the condensation sliding down my water glass, the way the droplets pooled at the base like time itself running out, and I thought about how Dad used to drink his coffee black. No sugar, no cream, saying life was bitter enough and you might as well meet it head on, and that coffee mug, the one chipped at the rim with the faded Cincinnati Reds logo, flashed in my mind. Not as nostalgia, but as a reminder, because it sat on the shelf in my kitchen now, and someday that little piece of ceramic would mean more than the entire estate my brother was so hungry to devour. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely audible but sharp with teenage honesty. "You don't have to do this here," she said to him, and Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it intimate and venomous. "Oh, sweetheart, I do. Because lies rot faster in the dark, and your father's whole life has been a lie." And the words made her flinch, and I wanted to leap across the table. But instead I sat frozen, my knuckles white on the silverware, because I knew every rash move now would only prove him right in their eyes. My cousin Mark muttered to his wife, not softly enough, "Well, he always was the risky one." And she nodded like it was a truth carved in stone, and I thought about all the hours no one saw, the late nights balancing budgets, the weekends fixing broken cars, the mornings when I pushed through exhaustion just to keep pace with a world that demanded everything. And yet here I was, reduced to a caricature, a cautionary tale at my own father's memorial dinner, the man stripped of dignity in front of blood who should have known better than to feed on one another like this. The air felt thick, the smell of steak and butter cloying, the buzz of conversation resuming in cautious spurts as if nothing had happened, and I sat in that silence between breaths, knowing that the humiliation wasn't just personal. It was legacy deep, something that would linger in Claire's memory unless I found a way to rewrite it. To turn this night into something more than defeat, and as I raised my glass finally, forcing steadiness into my hand, I said, "To Dad, who taught me you can bury a man's name in the dirt, but the roots always find their way back to the surface." And for a split second, the table fell quiet again, because they didn't know if I was broken or dangerous. And in truth, I wasn't sure either. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end. This was only the start of something they wouldn't see coming. Not from me, not from the man they thought they'd already buried alive. And when I lowered my glass, I caught Daniel watching me with the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes, a hairline crack in his armor. And that was enough to keep me breathing. Enough to keep me waiting for the right moment to pull the thread that would unravel him completely. Though I had to sit there another hour with the taste of bitterness on my tongue, knowing that every second I endured now would become a weapon later, sharpened and aimed directly at the heart of his smug triumph. And when I finally stood to excuse myself from the table, my daughter's hand brushed mine, trembling but present. And that touch told me she still believed in me, even if she didn't know how much I still had left to prove. Her fingers were cool against my palm, trembling with something that felt like both apology and defiance. And I squeezed back just enough to tell her without words that I was still standing, still here. Though inside my chest my heart felt like a trapped bird slamming against its cage, desperate to get out, and I walked away from that table with the murmur of voices prickling at my back. Like an invisible current of judgment following me down the carpeted hallway toward the dimly lit bar at the edge of the banquet hall, where the bartender, a kid who couldn't have been older than 21, glanced up at me with a kind of wary sympathy as I slid onto a stool and muttered, "Whiskey neat," though even as he poured it I could still hear Daniel's voice echoing in my skull. Those words twisted into something permanent, and the laughter they drew clung to me like smoke that wouldn't wash off. I stared at the amber liquid, watching the way the light caught the glass, and thought about Dad's old Reds mug again. Chipped but unbreakable, how he'd once told me, "What survives isn't always the prettiest thing on the shelf, but it's the one that proves it can take a hit." And I swallowed the whiskey hard, letting it burn all the way down as if pain could be melted by fire. A couple of second cousins wandered up, too polite to say anything, but too curious to walk away, and one of them, Jason, cleared his throat and said, "You know, Mike, maybe he didn't mean it like that." And I turned to him with a half smile sharp enough to cut paper and said, "Jason, you've never known my brother a day in your life if you think he ever does anything by accident." And the silence that followed was so thick he shuffled back without another word, dragging his wife by the elbow like he'd just touched a live wire. I ordered another whiskey, not because I wanted to drown, but because I needed the weight of it in my hand. Something solid, something mine, and I let the ice rattle against the glass as if it were a clock ticking down to something none of them could see. My phone buzzed on the bar, a text from my coworker Ben, one of the few men who actually understood the grind of keeping a job where middle management means being chewed up from both ends, and the text read, "Heard about the will. You okay?" I stared at it for a long moment, the words blurring, and finally typed back, "Not yet, but I will be." As soon as I hit send, another message popped up, this one from an unknown number, and when I opened it my blood went cold. It was a photo of me, head down at the bar, whiskey in hand, time-stamped just seconds earlier, and I knew in that instant, Daniel had already set the trap, already arranged someone to catch me looking like a failure on the very night he crowned himself the heir. And I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head, because it was such a predictable move, and yet it still hit like a sucker punch. I muttered under my breath, always one step ahead with the showmanship, and the bartender raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure if I was talking to him, but I waved it off, slipping the phone back into my pocket like I was holstering a weapon I wasn't ready to fire. I left the bar and found myself outside on the patio. The night air biting with early November chill, my breath fogging in front of me as headlights from cars pulling in and out of the lot cut sharp angles across the pavement, and I leaned against the railing, staring up at a sky that looked like a black canvas smeared with faint city glow. My Uncle Jim stepped out behind me, his jacket half-zipped, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, and he said, "Hell of a show in there," with that tone that wasn't quite sympathetic, wasn't quite cruel, just observational, like he'd seen this kind of spectacle 100 times before. I didn't turn to face him, just said, "Funny how grief brings out the vultures," and he chuckled, smoke curling around his face. "Your dad always said money was the quickest way to find out what your family really thinks of you." I finally glanced at him, catching the gleam of his eyes in the dark, and said, Guess he was right. And Jim shrugged, flicking ash into the night. You got fight in you, Mike. I can see it. Just make sure you aim it at the right target. His words stuck with me longer than I wanted them to because he'd always been one of those men who spoke little but meant it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just given me permission to become something more dangerous than Daniel imagined. When I finally went back inside, the dinner was breaking up, people standing in clusters with their drinks, voices rising and falling like waves, and I saw Daniel across the room, arm around his wife, laughing with a group of cousins, his face lit with the kind of self-satisfaction only a man who thinks he's untouchable can wear. And I thought about all the years I'd spent carrying more than my share, about the weekends Dad called me to fix something around the house while Daniel was off golfing, about the checks I quietly wrote when bills came due and no one else could cover them, and yet here he was, rewriting history in front of everyone, and worse, doing it in front of Claire. I pushed through the crowd, my shoulder brushing strangers, until I stood close enough to hear him say, well, Dad knew better than to trust him with money. He'd have blown it on some half-baked project like always. And before I could stop myself, I said, loud enough for the circle to hear, funny, Danny, because last time you had a project, you called me to bail you out, remember? His head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing, and for a moment the group went silent. The air charged like before a storm, and he recovered with a laugh. You see? Always living in the past, folks, dragging up scraps as if they matter. But I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes because he knew I had more than scraps, and I let the silence hang just long enough before saying, careful. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. I walked away before he could answer, heart pounding, because I knew I had to pace myself. One strike now, one seed planted, another later. And as I headed toward the coat check, Claire intercepted me, her eyes wide. Dad, why are you letting him do this? I wanted to tell her everything. About the detail I'd noticed in Dad's files, the overlooked clause in the estate papers, the thing I'd tucked away for the right moment. But instead I just said, because revenge isn't served raw, sweetheart. It needs heat, pressure, and patience. And she frowned, not understanding, but I knew someday she would, and I kissed the top of her head before pulling on my coat. The night felt colder than before. The parking lot buzzing with departing cars, engines growling in the dark, and as I unlocked mine, headlights flashed across my windshield, forcing me to squint, and I saw Daniel standing by his sleek black SUV, his silhouette framed like a villain in some low-budget crime drama, his phone glowing in his hand as he glanced at me with a smile that promised this was only round one. And I smiled back, because what he didn't know was that the game was already rigged, not by his money, not by his charm, but by something small, something he hadn't noticed. And I intended to let him keep laughing until the ground gave way under his feet. I slid into the driver's seat, the vinyl cold against my back, and for a long moment I just sat there gripping the wheel, watching Daniel's reflection in the side mirror as he typed something into his phone. Probably another little barb he'd scatter into some group chat of cousins, or maybe even leak onto Facebook where half the family would nod along, as if his version of the story were gospel. And I thought about how quickly narratives get written in this world, how easy it is for one loud voice to erase a lifetime of quiet work, and the anger simmered low and steady in me like coals waiting for the right breath to ignite. But I forced myself to turn the key, engine rumbling to life, headlights sweeping across the cracked asphalt as I pulled out. And Claire's silence beside me was heavier than any insult he'd thrown, her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights like she didn't want me to see her disappointment, though I could feel it, sharp as glass under skin. The drive home was a blur of brake lights and neon signs, the gas station on the corner where I used to scrape together change for coffee in my 20s, the shuttered diner where Dad and I once sat nursing mugs after Reds games, the strip mall gym where I'd tried and failed to keep a routine alive during the years when every hour belonged to someone else, and all of it felt like ghosts pressing against the glass, whispering that maybe Daniel was right. Maybe I'd always been the man who carried weight without payoff, the one who showed up but never cashed in. Still, when I pulled into our driveway, the porch light glowing soft and yellow against the siding, I felt a strange steadiness, like I'd just survived the first round of a fight, and though I'd been bloodied, I was still upright. And sometimes that was victory enough. Inside, Claire disappeared to her room without a word, and I stood in the kitchen staring at the shelf where Dad's Reds mug sat, chipped rim catching the light from the overhead lamp, and I pulled it down, running my thumb over the crack like it was a scar that hadn't healed right. And I thought about how symbols don't choose us, we choose them, and then we're stuck with whatever truth they carry. I poured coffee into it even though it was late, even though it would keep me up, because I needed that bitterness, needed it to remind me I wasn't finished. And as I leaned against the counter sipping it black, I whispered, "You were wrong about me, Dad. You'll see," though part of me wondered if I believed it yet. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Daniel himself, a single line that read, "Hope you enjoyed dinner. Don't drink too much, wouldn't want Claire to see you like that." My fist tightened around the mug, the urge to smash it against the wall almost overwhelming. But instead I typed back, "Careful what you wish for. Some things spill louder than you think." And though he didn't respond, I knew the seed had been planted, the kind of vague threat that would gnaw at him in the quiet moments. The next morning I woke early, not out of peace, but because my mind wouldn't let me rest, and I went for a run through the neighborhood, breath clouding in the frosty air, my legs heavy but determined, the rhythmic thud of sneakers on pavement pulling me into some version of control. And I thought about Dad again, about the will, about the clause I'd spotted months earlier when I'd been helping him organize papers, a line so small no one else had bothered to read it, a condition tied to responsibility, not blood, and the memory of it hummed like a secret engine under my ribs, something that could one day flip the entire balance of power if I played it right. Passing houses with Halloween decorations still half collapsed on lawns, I felt that old American ache of comparison, the constant scoreboard of who has more, who looks better, who's winning the invisible race, and I laughed out loud, startling a dog behind a fence, because wasn't that the very currency Daniel thrived on? Image, comparison, perception. And if that was the game, I could learn to play too, maybe even beat him at it, because underneath his charm was weakness, arrogance, carelessness, the kind of cracks that only widen under pressure. At work later that week, I buried myself in spreadsheets and project deadlines, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, coworkers drifting by with forced small talk about football scores and holiday travel plans, and I kept my head down, knowing the whispers about the will would reach them eventually, because nothing stays in the family anymore, not in the age of group texts and screenshots. But instead of shrinking, I leaned into the grind, staying late, pushing through until the janitor flicked the lights as a hint, because I needed to remember I wasn't the man Daniel painted me to be. Still, when I left the office, my phone buzzed with another message. This time a photo of Claire at school posted on some cousin's Instagram story captioned, "Hope she's stronger than her dad," and my chest tightened, because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was war on every front, and for the first time I realized that Daniel's cruelty wasn't just aimed at humiliation, it was aimed at legacy, at rewriting the Carter name itself, and that was something I couldn't allow. I sat in my car staring at the glow of my phone screen, hands shaking, and I muttered, "If you want war, Daniel, you'll get it." And though no one could hear me, the words felt like the first true vow I'd made in years, one that carried weight beyond anger, something closer to destiny. I drove home in silence, headlights carving the road, and when I walked in the door, Claire was at the kitchen table with her book spread out, earbuds in, but she looked up long enough to say, "Don't let him win." And though her voice cracked, it was enough, because if there was one thing I couldn't stand, it was the idea of my daughter growing up believing her father was weak. I sat across from her, sipping coffee gone cold, and in that moment I decided I would use every tool at my disposal, memory, detail, patience, even bureaucracy itself, to turn the tables because the truth was simple. Daniel might have inherited Dad's estate, but I had inherited his resilience, his eye for the fine print, and in the end that would prove deadlier than any dollar sign. I lay awake that night long after Claire's bedroom light clicked off, the house steeped in silence except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing down our street, and I stared at the ceiling thinking about how humiliation doesn't just sting in the moment. It echoes. It reverberates through your mind at odd hours, like a song you can't shut off. But somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, staring at the faint outline of the Reds mug on the counter where I'd left it, I realized that humiliation can also be a forge, and if you're patient enough, it hardens you into something sharper than the man who walked into the banquet hall in the first place. The next day, I forced myself into routine. Coffee, tie knotted tight, a run through morning traffic with talk radio filling the car, the host ranting about gas prices and job cuts, the same background noise that fills every American commute. But beneath the drone of it, I was plotting, turning over every angle of Dad's estate papers in my memory. Rehearsing the moment I'd first seen that clause about responsibility, about how inheritance could be voided if evidence surfaced of misconduct or failure to fulfill obligations tied to the trust. At the time I'd barely registered it, just another line in a sea of legalese, but now it felt like a fuse running straight under Daniel's feet, and all I had to do was find the match. At the office, my coworkers gathered around the break room TV watching highlights from the weekend's NFL games, arguing about whether the Bengals had blown their playoff shot already, and I joined them for a few minutes, nodding, throwing in a comment or two, anything to seem normal, but inside I was replaying Daniel's smirk. The way his arm tightened around his wife's shoulder as if to say he'd already won, and I thought about how victory breeds complacency, how arrogance always leaves fingerprints, and I just had to know where to look. Mid-afternoon, I got an email from HR about updating my life insurance beneficiaries, and it made me laugh out loud, startling the intern next to me, because here I was, a man everyone called irresponsible, and yet I was the one keeping paperwork in order while Daniel probably hadn't looked at a contract in years. It reminded me of something Dad used to say when he worked nights at the factory. The man who actually reads the manual runs the machine, and I realized maybe the same rule applied to life. That evening, Claire came into the living room while I was half buried in folders I'd dragged from the basement. Old tax returns, insurance policies, letters Dad had written when he was executor of Grandpa's estate. And she said softly, "You're working like it's another job." And I smiled tiredly, looking up at her. "Sweetheart, sometimes survival is the job." And she tilted her head, studying me in a way that felt older than her years, before asking, "So, what's the plan?" I almost laughed because what teenager asks their dad about a plan for revenge? But the seriousness in her voice kept me steady, and I told her just enough. "Your uncle thinks he's already won, but there's more than one way to lose. He's left a trail and I just have to follow it." She frowned but nodded, whispering, "Don't let him take you down with him," before heading upstairs, and her words clung to me like a warning. 2 days later, the trail appeared on its own. I got a call from Uncle Jim, his gravelly voice low like he was already halfway into his nightly pack of cigarettes, and he said, "Mike, you didn't hear this from me, but Daniel's been bragging down at the club. Big plans for Dad's money, some development deal he's pushing through quick, says it'll double the estate in a year." I pinched the bridge of my nose because I knew Daniel's version of quick meant cutting corners, maybe even crossing lines, and I asked, "You know what kind of deal?" Jim coughed, exhaled smoke into the receiver. "Real estate. Something about flipping land outside Cincinnati. All I know is he's already running his mouth about profit margins." I thanked him and hung up, heart racing, because I suddenly remembered Dad's estate papers, including a clause forbidding the executor from using assets for speculative investments, exactly the kind of clause Daniel would have skimmed over. That was the match I'd been looking for, and all I needed now was proof. I drove out that weekend under the pretense of visiting a buddy, but really I headed toward the address Jim had given me, a half-built subdivision on the edge of town, muddy lots littered with construction equipment, sales banners flapping in the wind. I parked far enough away to watch, sipping coffee from a paper cup, and sure enough, Daniel's SUV rolled in, his shiny shoes sinking into mud as he barked orders at a couple of contractors. I snapped photos from my phone, zooming in on him pointing at blueprints, shaking hands, even pulling out his checkbook at one point. And I felt adrenaline surge because this wasn't just arrogance, it was negligence in broad daylight, and negligence leaves receipts. My fingers trembled as I typed a note to myself. Check property deeds, financing trail, investor agreements. Dad always said the truth hides in paper, not in people's mouths, and standing there watching my brother strut across the mud, I finally understood what he meant. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with files spread around me, Red's mug at my elbow, and I whispered one of those philosophies Dad drilled into me. The man who builds on sand forgets the tide always comes back. I wrote it down in a notebook, not just for me but for Claire, because I wanted her to see someday that even in the middle of betrayal you could still find clarity. As I worked, my phone buzzed again. This time a text from Daniel himself, just a smirking emoji followed by, "Heard you were snooping. Careful, Mikey, wouldn't want people to think you're jealous." My hands tightened on the phone, and I nearly replied with something cutting, but instead I smiled, because the fact he knew meant he was nervous, and nervous men make mistakes. I slipped the phone face down on the table, picked up my mug, and muttered, "Let him sweat." But as midnight stretched toward morning, a new worry gnawed at me. What if Daniel wasn't just humiliating me for sport? What if he really wanted to erase me, legally, socially, even digitally? The photo at the bar, the Instagram story about Claire, the text designed to make me lash out. They weren't random. They were chess moves. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized he wasn't just trying to win the estate, he was trying to paint me as unstable, unfit, the kind of man a judge or lawyer would dismiss outright if it ever came to a challenge. That thought sank heavy in my chest, because it meant I couldn't afford one wrong step, couldn't give him a single slip to twist against me, and as I finally closed the files and headed to bed, I repeated one phrase under my breath like armor. Patience sharpens the blade. The phrase, "Patience sharpens the blade," echoed in my head as I walked into the office the next morning. Tie slightly crooked from lack of sleep, shoulders squared in that artificial way you carry yourself when you're pretending the weight doesn't bother you. The receptionist, a kind woman named Gloria, who'd been with the company longer than I had, smiled as I passed, but her eyes lingered a second too long, and that was when I realized Daniel's whispers had already reached here. Sure enough, by lunchtime I caught two coworkers leaning together at the coffee machine, voices lowered but not low enough, one saying, "You hear his brothers got him on edge? Family mess inheritance. They say Michael snapped at the banquet," and the other shaking his head. "Shame. He seemed steady enough." Their words slid into me like splinters, but I kept my stride, carried my salad back to my desk, and forced myself to chew even though each bite tasted like cardboard. Daniel wasn't just spreading lies. He was constructing a persona for me, the unstable brother, the bitter loser, and if I didn't counter it carefully, it would calcify into the version everyone believed. That night, I logged onto Facebook, a place I usually avoided, and found Daniel had posted a photo from some charity gala, him in a tuxedo, Emily clinging to his arm, the caption reading, "When family fails, you build your own legacy." It had 50 likes, a dozen comments praising his generosity, and not a single person knew that he'd funneled estate funds into that very gala, just to look philanthropic. I stared at the screen, knuckles whitening on the mouse before closing the tab. My first instinct was to comment, expose him right there in public, but I remembered Dad's mantra, "Don't waste a bullet on a shadow." Aim for the man. Social media was smoke, paper was fire. I reopened my files and wrote another note to myself. Track gala invoices, confirm payment source. Still, the digital war bled into my personal life. Claire came home from school the next day looking pale, dropping her backpack with a thud. When I asked what was wrong, she muttered, "Uncle Daniel posted something about us. Kids at school are sharing it." I pulled out my phone, heart thudding, and saw Daniel's Instagram story. A blurry shot of Claire laughing at Thanksgiving, cropped to look like she was mocking me, overlaid with the words, "Even she knows who the real man is." My jaw clenched so tight it hurt, and Claire whispered, "Dad, make him stop," her voice small, afraid, and I had to swallow every ounce of fury to keep from storming to Daniel's house right then. Instead, I hugged her and said, "I promise you, sweetheart, he'll regret every word." And as she buried her face in my chest, I realized Daniel had crossed a line. It wasn't just about me anymore. He was weaponizing my daughter, and that made this war personal in a way even money couldn't. I needed allies. That weekend, I visited Dad's old attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Harold, who wore bow ties like armor. His office smelled of old leather and ink, books stacked high like fortresses, and when I explained Daniel's speculative investments and the estate clause forbidding them, Harold's eyebrows rose. "If what you say is true," he murmured, tapping his pen against the desk, "then your brother is in breach of fiduciary duty. Courts don't look kindly on executors who gamble with trusts." I handed him the photos I'd taken at the construction site, and his lips curved into the faintest smile. "This is a start," he said. "But we'll need more contracts, receipts, proof he's using estate funds, not his own." I nodded, already thinking about my next move, and as I stood to leave, Harold added, "One more thing, Michael. Don't let him provoke you. If he can paint you as unstable, it undermines everything. Stay calm, document everything, and let the evidence speak." Driving home through the dusky streets, headlights streaking across wet pavement, I repeated Harold's advice to myself like a prayer. Stay calm, document everything. But calm was hard to keep when Daniel escalated again. Sunday afternoon, as Claire and I sat watching the Bengals game, My phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had uploaded a video to YouTube titled Michael Barnes Meltdown. My stomach dropped as I clicked it open. It was a clipped, shaky recording from Thanksgiving. Me standing, voice raised, saying, "You don't deserve the head seat at this table," but spliced and edited to make it look like I'd been ranting incoherently for minutes, face red, hands flailing. The comments were brutal. "This guy's unhinged. No wonder his brother got the estate. Sad to see a man lose it like this." Claire stared at the screen, horrified, and whispered, "Dad, that's not fair." I shut the laptop with more force than I meant to, breathing hard, and muttered, "No, it's not. But fairness doesn't win wars. Proof does." So I doubled down. Monday morning, I requested time off work under the guise of family matters and drove to the county clerk's office, a drab building with fluorescent lights that flickered like they hadn't been changed since the 90s. I spent hours combing through property deeds, financial filings, scanning line after line until my eyes blurred, and then I found it. A transfer of estate funds into a shell LLC tied to Daniel's name, the same LLC that had purchased the subdivision land. My hands trembled as I printed copies, the ink still warm, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a surge of control. This wasn't rumor or perception. This was evidence, cold and undeniable. That night, I laid the documents across the kitchen table, Red's mug beside them, and Claire leaned over my shoulder, eyes wide. "Is this it? Is this what gets him?" she asked, and I smiled grimly. "It's the beginning." But even as I said it, I knew Daniel wouldn't stop. He'd see me digging, and he'd strike harder lower until one of us broke. The question was, who would break first? As if on cue, my phone buzzed again. A new message from an unknown number. A photo of Claire walking home from school, snapped from a distance, with the caption, "Careful, Mikey. Accidents happen." My chest constricted, rage surging hot and violent, and for a moment I nearly threw the phone against the wall. But then I remembered Harold's words, and I forced myself to breathe, to think. Daniel wanted me unstable. He wanted me reckless. Instead, I saved the message, emailed it to myself, and wrote another note. File police report. Harassment evidence. I wasn't just fighting for the estate anymore. I was fighting for my daughter's safety, and that made my resolve unbreakable. That night, as Claire slept upstairs, I sat alone with the documents spread before me and whispered to the empty kitchen, "You wanted a war, Daniel. Now you'll get one." The day after I found the transfer records, the air itself seemed heavier. Like the walls of my house knew I was holding something explosive and were bracing for the fallout. I didn't sleep much. Every creak in the floorboards sent me checking Claire's room, making sure she was safe, while my mind spun with strategies. Who to show the documents to first, how to preserve the chain of evidence, what step Daniel would take once he realized I'd pierced his armor. Morning sunlight slanted through the blinds, painting lines across the papers still spread on the table beside my Red's mug, and I whispered to myself, "One step at a time. Don't rush the swing." That was Dad's voice in my head again, reminding me that revenge wasn't just about the strike. It was about timing it so perfectly that the other man never saw it coming until it was too late. I drove the documents to Harold's office first thing. He looked over the papers, lips pressed tight, and muttered, "This isn't just smoke, Michael. This is fire." These transfers proved Daniel used estate funds for personal investments. Courts could remove him as executor for this. I felt a tight thrill in my chest, the kind that comes when a battle suddenly shifts in your favor, but Harold wasn't smiling. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and said, "You have to be ready. Once Daniel realizes you're armed with this, he'll come after you with everything. Reputation, threats, maybe worse. He's already stooped low. He'll go lower." I nodded, because I'd already felt the edge of that with the photo of Claire. Still, hearing Harold confirm it hardened my resolve. I wasn't imagining the danger. I was staring right at it. By afternoon, the war bled into my job. My supervisor called me in, voice apologetic but firm, saying, "Michael, there've been concerns. People are saying you've been distracted, unstable even. There's chatter online about that video." His eyes softened. "Look, I don't believe everything I read, but upper management wants you on leave until things settle." The words hit like a gut punch. Daniel had done it. He'd poisoned the well at work too. As I cleared out my desk, coworkers avoided my gaze, whispering as if I were contagious. It was exactly the picture Daniel wanted. Me, unraveling, pushed to the margins while he strutted forward, unchallenged. But what he didn't know was that leave gave me more time, more focus to dedicate fully to dismantling him. He thought he'd weakened me. He'd only freed me. That night, Claire found me sitting at the kitchen table, face in my hands, and she quietly placed her small palm over mine. "You're not crazy, Dad," she whispered, eyes fierce with a child's raw honesty. "He's the crazy one." Her words lit something inside me, not rage, not despair, but a steadier fire, the clarity of knowing someone believed me fully, even when the world was tilting against me. I squeezed her hand and promised, "We'll prove it, Claire, together." It was then I realized this wasn't just my revenge. It was our survival story, a legacy I owed her as much as Dad. The next day, Harold filed a motion to demand Daniel's financial accounting as executor. It was a legal shot across the bow, formal and undeniable. When Daniel got word, he called me, not a polite, mediated call, but late at night, number flashing across my phone, voice slurred with fury. "You think you're clever, Mikey? You think you've got something on me? All you've got is scraps, and I've got the whole table. People believe me. They see you for what you are, a washed-up, bitter has-been. And if you drag this into court, you're gonna regret it. You and that little girl of yours. Accidents happen, you know?" The line crackled, his words slithering through the receiver like poison, and for a moment I was frozen, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles ached. Then I said, voice low and steady, "You've already lost, Daniel. Every word you just said, recorded." And I hung up though my hands were shaking. The recording app blinked on my screen, proof of his threat captured in clean audio. For the first time I had his voice betraying him, but Daniel wasn't done. The following week, as Claire walked out of school, a black car idled at the curb. She swore later she saw a man inside watching her, but when she blinked, the car pulled away. That night she begged me not to make her go back, tears streaking her cheeks and rage nearly consumed me. I wanted to storm Daniel's house, drag him out, make him feel the same fear he'd planted in my daughter. Instead, I filed the police report, attached the threatening text, the audio recording, and Claire's account. The officer was polite but cautious, saying, "We'll keep an eye on it, sir, but these cases can be tricky. Family disputes money, it muddies things." I walked out frustrated but more determined than ever. If the law wouldn't protect us fully, then I would. Meanwhile, Daniel countered the legal filing with PR flair. He hired a local paper to run a puff piece about him. Young entrepreneur revitalizes community housing, complete with glossy photos of him shaking hands at the construction site. He framed himself as the savior of the city, while I became the bitter brother trying to tear him down. Reading the article, bile rose in my throat, but instead of shredding the paper, I clipped it carefully and filed it with the evidence. Because lies might dazzle the public, but lies can be used against their maker once the truth comes out. That weekend, Harold and I spread everything across his oak conference table. Financial transfers, construction photos, Daniel's threats, the puff piece article, even the YouTube meltdown clip as proof of defamation. It felt like laying out weapons before a battle, each piece sharper than it looked alone. Harold looked me in the eye and said, "Michael, you're not just defending yourself anymore. You're building a case that could strip Daniel of everything, but this will get ugly. Are you ready for that?" My answer came without hesitation. He made it ugly the moment he went after Claire. That night, back at home, as rain lashed against the windows and the house felt smaller under the storm, I pulled out Dad's Reds mug, filled it with coffee, and sat staring at the reflection in the dark liquid. It wasn't just a mug anymore. It was a reminder of where I came from, Dad's voice, his steady hand, the legacy Daniel was trying to steal. I realized then that this mug was my anchor, the symbol of my fight. Daniel had his glossy photographs and empty applause. I had truth, blood, and memory. And in the end, truth is heavier than lies. When I finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I paused at Claire's door, watching her sleep, the soft rhythm of her breathing a fragile reminder of what I was fighting for. I whispered into the darkness, "He thinks he's untouchable, but he's already falling. We'll show them who he really is." And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and exhaustion, I felt the click of something inevitable. The moment a blade slides into place, ready to strike. By the time the first court hearing date arrived, I'd stopped thinking of myself as the weaker brother scrambling to survive Daniel's games. Instead, I felt like a man sharpening a blade in plain sight, letting my opponent laugh while the steel gleamed brighter each day. The courthouse in Cincinnati smelled faintly of old wood and colder judgment. Its walls lined with portraits of judges who'd stared down liars before and carved truth from chaos, and I walked through its doors gripping my leather folder like a weapon. Daniel was already inside, flanked by his high-priced attorneys in tailored suits, grinning at reporters as though the hearing was a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, and he said with practiced charm, "This is a sad misunderstanding, folks. Family disputes always bring out heightened emotions, but the truth will prevail." His voice dripped honey, but his eyes, when they flicked to mine, burned with venom. I didn't answer him, didn't feed the press. I simply walked past, silent, steady, like a man who knows his moment hasn't come yet, but will. Inside, the judge's gavel cracked the air, and the procedural dance began. Harold laid out the motion, citing Daniel's unexplained transfers and discrepancies in estate accounts, while Daniel's lawyers countered with rehearsed lines about temporary reallocations and investments aligned with the estate's best interest. For a while, it looked like Daniel's showmanship might win the day. The judge furrowed his brow, skeptical, asking pointed questions but not yet leaning our way. Then Harold played the recording, Daniel's late-night threat, his voice unmistakable as he slurred, "Accidents happen, you know?" The courtroom fell into a silence so sharp I could hear my own pulse. Daniel's jaw clenched, his lawyer's face went pale, and the judge's expression hardened. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a crack in Daniel's glass mask, a glimpse for the world to see. When the session adjourned, Daniel stormed past me, his whisper cutting like a knife. "You think that'll save you? I'll bury you deeper than Dad ever could have imagined." I let him walk, didn't react, but inside I felt the shift. For the first time, Daniel had slipped, shown the anger he usually hid behind charm. The mask was fraying, and once a mask cracks, it never fits the same again. That evening, back home, I sat with Claire at the table, the Reds mug steaming between us, and explained what happened in court. She listened intently, her eyes wide, and when I finished, she asked, "So people believe you now?" I thought about it, the reporters outside, the silence in the courtroom, the murmurs as the recording played, and I said, "They're starting to, but it's not enough to win. We need them to see him for who he really is, everywhere, not just in court." Claire nodded solemnly, like she understood more than a child her age should, and then she whispered, "Then show them. Use what he does to you, turn it back." And in that moment, I realized my daughter had voiced the very strategy I'd been circling around. I couldn't just defend myself from Daniel's smears. I had to flip them, to expose him using the very stage he built. The chance came sooner than expected. A week later, Daniel announced a gala fundraiser for his community housing project, inviting business leaders, local politicians, and half the city's media. It was the perfect theater for his saint act, and the perfect stage to make him stumble. I'd bought a ticket. Harold cautioned me against making a scene, but I wasn't planning theatrics. I was planning precision. The night of the gala, I stood in the back of the glittering ballroom, watching Daniel work the crowd like a maestro, laughter and applause following him, as servers floated by with champagne. He spotted me across the room, smirked, and lifted his glass in mock salute, certain I was just a shadow haunting his triumph. He had no idea I'd already fed a journalist copies of the transfer records and the puff piece article with annotations showing the inconsistencies, the inflated numbers, the contractors who didn't exist. The journalist wasn't writing a piece yet. She was watching, gathering, waiting to pounce when Daniel least expected it. But the real moment came during Daniel's speech. He stood on stage, spotlight painting in golden, saying, "This project isn't just about buildings, it's about family. About carrying forward the values my late father instilled in us. Honesty, hard work, integrity." The crowd nodded, clapped, some even teared up. And then from the back I let my hand rise, voice steady but cutting through the applause. "Funny, Daniel. If Dad valued honesty so much, why are there millions missing from his estate? Why are contractors being paid who don't even exist?" The room froze. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Daniel's smile faltered, his eyes widened, and for the first time in public, he looked cornered. He tried to laugh it off. "My brother's confused, grieving, let's not air family disputes tonight." But the whispers had already started, the murmurs snaking through the crowd. Phones lit up, people Googling, searching, doubting. The seed was planted, and it was spreading fast. Security escorted me out, but I walked willingly, head high. Outside in the cool night air, I pulled the Reds mug from my bag, unscrewed the lid of coffee I'd brought with me, and took a slow sip as if savoring victory not yet won, but inevitable. Because I knew tomorrow the whispers from that ballroom would turn into questions, and questions into investigations. Daniel had ruled with perception, with image, and I'd just torn the first hole in his curtain. When I got home, Claire was waiting by the window, worried, but when she saw me smiling, she ran into my arms. "Did it work?" she asked breathlessly. I kissed her forehead and said, "It's starting to. He won't see it coming, but the world's about to see him for who he is." And as I tucked her into bed, I realized this was no longer just about inheritance, or revenge, or even justice. It was about legacy, about ensuring that when people spoke our family's name, they remembered Dad's truth, not Daniel's lies. And somewhere, in the shadows of that night, I imagined Daniel pacing his penthouse, glass shattering against the wall, fury erupting where once there had only been smugness. Because now he knew I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was hunting. The morning after the gala, I woke to the subtle glow of my phone screen, notifications stacked like dominoes, messages from journalists following up, emails from Harold outlining additional angles, and inevitably, a string of frantic texts from Daniel, all unreadable rage and veiled threats. I didn't answer. I sipped coffee from the chipped Reds mug, letting the bitterness anchor me as I read through the messages, each one confirming that the seeds planted the night before had taken root. The gala footage had already started circulating online, murmurs in social media threads pointing out discrepancies in Daniel's story, comments questioning the missing contractors, the sudden, unexplained wealth. He had built his empire on perception, on charm and perception was crumbling under the weight of truth. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her backpack slung over the chair, watching me like a little general observing strategy unfold. "Are they really listening?" she asked. I smiled, ruffling her hair. "They are. And that's the problem for him. He didn't count on someone who's careful, someone who watches, someone who waits. He only played offense. I play offense and defense at the same time." She nodded, understanding more than her years warranted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange relief. Not because victory was assured, but because I was finally in the driver's seat. By mid-morning, I was back at Harold's office, going over financial ledgers, contracts, and emails, cross-referencing Daniel's claims with tangible evidence. Every discrepancy was another arrow in my quiver, a canceled payment disguised as a refund, an invoice for materials that never existed, a wire transfer flagged as personal expense, despite originating from estate funds. Each document added clarity, but more importantly, it added inevitability. Daniel had relied on sloppy paperwork, assuming arrogance and charm could cover mistakes. I realized then that negligence was not weakness. It was opportunity. Daniel's desperation became apparent that afternoon. My phone buzzed with a new email, this one from a mutual family attorney I rarely spoke to, reading, "Daniel insists on a private meeting tomorrow. Wants to negotiate before things get messy." It was an attempt to co-opt me, to make me appear the villain if I refused, but I knew better. I replied politely, confirming the meeting and forwarding the thread to Harold, who grinned. "He's trying to manipulate you, but in doing so he's creating evidence. Keep the tone professional, record everything, and he will hang himself." The next day, I sat across from Daniel at the law office, a thin veneer of civility masking the seething tension beneath. He smiled too widely, hands steepled on the table. "Mikey," he said, mock warmth in his voice, "let's find a way to settle this without tearing the family apart. I'm willing to be generous." I leaned back, folding my hands, and said calmly, "Daniel, generosity isn't the problem. Transparency is. You've been anything but transparent with Dad's estate, and every record we have contradicts your story." His smile faltered for a microsecond, just long enough for me to know the truth had punctured his armor. Then he leaned forward, voice dropping. "You think you've got it all figured out, but I can make life very uncomfortable. Your little girl, your job, your reputation, everything. You won't win." I let his words hang in the air, and then, quiet but firm, I said, "Threats are evidence, Daniel. Keep talking." The subtle click of his jaw, the twitch in his left eye, told me more than any number of spreadsheets could. He was panicking. Leaving the office, I felt the adrenaline of the confrontation still thrumming in my veins. I called Claire over FaceTime, showing her the folders, the emails, and the voice recording. See this? This is how you fight, I said. Not with anger, but with proof. People who rely on lies crumble when the truth is visible. She nodded, eyes shining. He'll never see it coming, right? I smiled grimly. Exactly. That's the art of it. By midweek, I had leveraged social media, carefully anonymizing screenshots and snippets of Daniel's mismanagement, feeding them to investigative journalists under the guise of concerned citizens. Each post, each tip, built a narrative without my name attached, eroding the carefully curated image Daniel had constructed over decades. I watched from the sidelines, coffee in hand, as his followers debated and doubted him, and I felt the first flicker of satisfaction. The man who thrived on public approval was now being consumed by it. Daniel's response was frantic. Photoshopped screenshots emerged online, attempting to make me look incompetent. Emails circulated with false claims about my instability. He hired a PR consultant to scrub negative mentions and spin the story. But every move he made left trails, footprints in digital sand that Harold and I collected meticulously. He was trapped in the very system he had thought could be manipulated: public perception, legal obligations, and digital permanence. That weekend, I drove Claire to her gymnastics class, the car filled with the familiar aroma of takeout coffee I'd grabbed on the way, and she asked, "Dad, what happens if he fights back harder?" I looked at her, the winter sunlight casting shadows across her determined face, and said, "Then we document it. Every move, every word, every slip. Because the bigger they think they are, the harder they fall when the foundation is rotten." She smiled, and I realized that in teaching her about patience, strategy, and resilience, I was also reinforcing my own mindset. By Monday, the first of Daniel's contractors reached out, panicked, admitting discrepancies, missing payments, and false invoices. Each testimony was a chink in Daniel's armor. Each email and recorded call became a weapon. The beauty of it was procedural justice. The system itself, when armed with evidence, could dismantle even the most charismatic manipulator. Daniel had relied on arrogance and charm. I relied on diligence, memory, and proof. And for the first time, it felt like the scales were tipping irreversibly. The week after the contractor confessions, I spent every waking hour at Harold's office, the Reds mug never far from my hand, steam curling from its rim as if carrying some silent promise. The table groaned under stacks of evidence: invoices, emails, screenshots, photographs, each piece another nail in the coffin of Daniel's facade. I traced each transaction, charted timelines, double-checked dates. Every tiny discrepancy became ammunition. Harold leaned back in his chair, adjusting his bow tie like a general surveying a battlefield. "You know, Michael," he said with a faint smirk, "he thinks this is about money, but really it's about control. And once the control slips, men like him do stupid things." I nodded, watching my coffee swirl, thinking of the first time I'd ever picked up this mug and felt Dad's steady hands in my own. This was our inheritance, our family legacy, and it wasn't his to destroy. Daniel's panic became a visible contagion. Reports surfaced of him calling the contractors repeatedly, sending frantic emails, threatening to withdraw projects, and in the midst of it all, I documented everything. Every overreaction, every misstep, every desperate attempt to rewrite history went into carefully cataloged folders, ready for court, ready for public exposure. By now, even his closest allies were murmuring doubts. Whispers of, "Is he hiding something? Have we seen all the facts?" The first cracks of distrust were appearing in the polished veneer he'd relied upon for years. Then came the email from Daniel himself, a new low in his escalating recklessness. "Michael, you think you're clever, but keep pushing and you'll regret the consequences. This isn't just about money, it's about your reputation, your life." I stared at it for a long moment, then calmly forwarded it to Harold. "Documented," I said, placing the phone face down next to the mug. "We're keeping score." In that instant, I realized the elegance of procedural justice. The law and the record of his own hand was now poised to do what emotion alone could not. He had boxed himself in with threats and lies. I just had to let it tighten. The next stage of the trap involved public exposure, carefully calibrated. I had contacted investigative reporters I trusted, sending them verifiable documentation, each file annotated to reveal patterns of mismanagement, discrepancies, and the looming threat of illegal transfers. I watched quietly from a corner as one journalist made calls, another started drafting questions, and Daniel remained oblivious, his arrogance blinding him to the gathering storm. Claire peeked from the doorway, whispering, "Are you going to make him fall?" I smiled faintly. "The system will, we just set it up." By midweek, Daniel's desperation began to show in more personal ways. A photographer caught him leaving his office building in a fury, storming past employees, nearly tipping a coffee cart. The footage spread online, unplanned and uncontrolled, juxtaposed against the carefully staged images he had tried to craft. His carefully cultivated persona was unraveling live, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction, knowing that all of this was happening exactly as predicted. The man who had relied on charm and smokescreens now had no room to hide, and each misstep he made fed directly into the narrative of his downfall. One night, I sat with Harold reviewing the legal filings, each page of documents thicker than a brick, each one a testament to the meticulous preparation that had brought us here. "He's going to try one last gamble," Harold said, voice low. "Expect threats, attempts to intimidate witnesses, perhaps even fake evidence. He knows the endgame is near." I nodded, sipping my coffee slowly, letting the warmth anchor me. "Then we wait for him to act," I replied. "Every move he makes now just strengthens our case." The discipline it required was almost meditative. Every heartbeat measured, every exhale a calibration of patience, and then it happened. Daniel tried to corner me digitally, sending a barrage of emails and texts designed to provoke me into lashing out publicly. Each one contained accusations, distortions of previous conversations, and insinuations about my stability. I smiled quietly to myself, picking up the Reds mug, inhaling the familiar aroma. I saved each message, forwarded them to Harold, and never responded. The provocation, meant to destabilize me, instead became the final layer of evidence, his own words betraying him. Every threat, every insult, every attempt at intimidation would soon be catalogued, time-stamped, and presented to the court and journalists alike. The crescendo came the following evening when Daniel called Claire's school, feigning concern, trying to sow fear among teachers and administrators. By the time I learned of it, Harold and I had already coordinated with school officials, providing context, documentation, and a formal complaint. Daniel's effort to manipulate perception backfired spectacularly, reinforcing the image of a man grasping at straws, a manipulator desperate to retain power. It was procedural poetry. The more he tried to spin the story, the tighter the evidence wrapped around him. Sitting in the quiet of my living room that night, Claire asleep upstairs, I reviewed the documents one last time. Each piece told a story, his greed, his manipulation, his overreach. I whispered to the empty room, "The bigger they build themselves up, the more satisfying the fall." And as I placed the Reds mug back on the counter, the steam curling faintly in the dim light, I realized we were ready. Every document, every recorded threat, every public misstep had aligned into a single inescapable narrative. The noose was ready to tighten, and Daniel would not see it coming. "You really think anyone here believes you, Daniel? You're pathetic. She chose me because you're too busy playing the hero to your own ego." The words slipped past my lips before I realized how loud they were, cutting across the hum of chatter in the restaurant where we were supposed to be discussing final settlement details. Heads turned, glasses paused midair, and for the first time, Daniel's carefully rehearsed calm cracked visibly, his face tightening like a mask being pulled too far. The lawyer sitting between us coughed awkwardly, pen hovering over paper, while a server froze with a tray of drinks, eyes darting between us as if expecting an explosion. And there in the far corner, I spotted Claire's reflection in the window behind the bar, pale but steady, her little fists clenched at her sides. I swallowed, forcing the final slice of satisfaction down with a measured calm, knowing she needed to see me unshakable. The thought flitted through my mind, oddly ironic, like narrating a war zone from within it, because this moment, the culmination of weeks of planning, patience, and cold observation, felt like a story unfolding in real time, every move deliberate, every misstep of his recorded and catalogued for future exposure. Daniel's smirk wavered. "Michael, this isn't the place," he began, but I cut him off, leaning back in my chair, watching him flinch, as though he were hearing a truth louder than any words in the room. We had arrived early, strategically, so that the restaurant's management, a few of Daniel's clients, and even reporters Harold had tipped off were present. Every angle had been calculated: the cameras, the witnesses, the environment, all designed so that no false narrative could survive. My eyes scanned the menu absent-mindedly while my mind ticked through the sequence. Emails from contractors, financial discrepancies highlighted, social media posts documented, audio of threats recorded and timestamped, all packaged like a detonator, waiting for the spark. Daniel had thought he was untouchable. He hadn't considered that the calm, diligent brother he dismissed as washed up had orchestrated a public reveal so precise it would leave him exposed from every angle. "I don't know what you're trying to do, Michael," Daniel said finally, voice low, almost shaking now. "People won't believe you. You've always been the failure." I lifted my coffee from the chipped Reds mug, the smell of dark roast filling my senses, a grounding ritual I had leaned on for weeks. "Failures," I said slowly, letting each syllable land, "are only those who stop fighting." I'd been patient, Daniel, waiting, recording, documenting. And every lie you told, every corner you cut, every threat you made has been captured. My words landed like stones in still water, rippling across the witnesses who were now quietly shifting, leaning forward, catching the subtle tension. Daniel's smirk snapped into something harsher, a mixture of fear and fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed, slamming his hand against the table. But his rage, uncontrolled, only further cemented the narrative we'd built. Every witness, every camera in the room now recorded his escalation. Every gesture he thought was intimidation became proof of the pattern of abuse and manipulation. I smiled faintly, letting the rhythm of justice unfold like a meticulous choreography. Claire's presence, though unseen by Daniel, anchored the moment. Her belief in me, her trust, had been the silent fuel through every late night of combing through ledgers, making phone calls, filing complaints, and cross-referencing receipts. She had asked me weeks ago, what happens if he fights back harder? And now, as Daniel's self-made chaos consumed him, I realized the answer. It always strengthens the case when the manipulator is desperate. I leaned slightly forward, voice calm but cutting, and said, "Do you see, Daniel? Every overreach, every lie, every corner you thought you could cut. It's all here, in black and white, in your own hand. And now the world sees it too." He tried to recover with charm, the same tactic he had always used to control perception. "Michael, we can still fix this. Let's not make a scene." I let the words hang, allowed them to flutter harmlessly past, and then pressed play on the tablet I had discreetly set on the table. Audio played, Daniel's own voice from weeks earlier, slurred and threatening. "Accidents happen, you know?" The room went still, heads turned, phones rose. Faces in the restaurant froze, absorbing the weight of evidence laid bare by his own hand. The air seemed to pulse with inevitability. Daniel's eyes darted around, realizing too late that every ally, every client, every casual bystander was now a witness to his unraveling. That's taken out of context," he shouted, voice rising. But the careful documentation Harold and I had created, emails, screenshots, timestamps, contractor confirmations, formed a cage around him. Every denial he attempted only served to tighten the perception of guilt. He was ensnared by his own actions, and each reaction, uncontrolled and frantic, was a nail in his public and legal coffin. I took a slow sip from the mug, the warmth grounding me while the room's atmosphere shifted. His empire, built on charm, misdirection, and audacity, had collapsed under the weight of careful observation and the meticulous, procedural record of his own behavior. I allowed myself a subtle, grim smile. This wasn't satisfaction born of cruelty but of justice, the kind Dad would have valued, the kind Claire deserved to witness, the kind that ensured that truth, not manipulation, carried the day. And then, as he lunged for a final retort, the double twist emerged. A text alert on my phone caught my attention. A contractor Daniel had tried to bribe for silence had just gone live with a full confession video, naming names, providing dates, and confirming every discrepancy. Within seconds, my earlier social media seeding began to merge with verified accounts and mainstream news alerts. Daniel's panic became palpable, almost physical, as the room filled with the sound of notifications pinging and murmurs of recognition spreading across tables. He realized, finally, that the trap was complete. No lies, no charm, No threats could extricate him now. I leaned back, Red's mug in hand, voice steady, and let the room absorb the conclusion before I whispered quietly, almost to myself. Truth always finds its mark, even if the archer waits decades for the shot. Outside, through the window, city lights blurred against the rain, and I could almost hear the lesson of a lifetime echo in the quiet hum of life beyond these walls. Diligence, patience, and unwavering integrity will always outlast manipulation, and even the mightiest ego can be undone by its own reflection. Daniel's panic was almost tangible, a storm contained within the confines of the restaurant, his carefully curated image shattering like glass under pressure. The confession video from the contractor played across multiple screens, corroborating every discrepancy I had documented, every missing payment, every falsified invoice. Faces turned toward him, whispers cascading into audible murmurs, and in that moment, I felt the delicate thrill of inevitability. The man who had once controlled perception with charm and bluster was now utterly exposed, his arrogance weaponized against him. Daniel's jaw clenched, a tremor in his hand betraying the fear he could no longer hide behind. He lunged toward his phone, fingers trembling, attempting to delete the video or contact allies to mitigate the fallout. But it was too late. The digital web I had woven, combined with procedural proof meticulously cataloged by Harold, ensured that nothing could be erased. Every social media thread, every email, every recorded threat existed in a permanent archive. The journalist I had tipped off earlier stepped forward, voice steady, stating the facts succinctly. Multiple sources confirmed financial misconduct, threats, and attempts to manipulate both contractors and family members. All evidence has been reviewed and verified. The room absorbed the weight of those words. Daniel's smile, that weaponized charm, faltered and finally crumbled entirely. I felt Claire's gaze on me from the corner, small but unwavering. She had watched me plan, wait, document, and endure, and now she saw the payoff, a combination of precision, patience, and justice. I whispered under my breath, as if both to her and to myself, even the tallest tower falls when the foundation is rotten. Daniel's eyes darted to hers, realizing too late that the child he had once tried to intimidate was the emotional anchor, the reason for every careful step I had taken. He had underestimated her, underestimated the stakes, underestimated me. As Daniel stumbled backward, muttering incoherently, the restaurant staff began closing in, guiding him toward the exit under the guise of maintaining decorum. Cameras caught every step, reporters murmured confirmations, and every client in the room now knew the extent of his deceit. The poetic symmetry was intoxicating. The man who thrived on appearances, who had manipulated family, law, and public perception alike, was now undone by the very transparency he scorned. The Red's mug on my table, still warm, still grounding, seemed almost to pulse with significance, the symbol of steady observation, patience, and truth, triumphing over bluster and ego. Then the final twist hit. I had kept one last piece of evidence in reserve. The original copy of Dad's will, the one Daniel had tried to suppress, with a notarized amendment he had ignored. An amendment explicitly leaving a symbolic portion of the estate in trust for Claire, not Daniel. The contractor confessions, the social media exposure, and the recording of threats had cornered him in public, but this legal document would complete the work. Pulling it from my briefcase, I laid it on the table, calm as ever. This, I said, letting my voice carry just enough to draw attention, shows the intent that Daniel tried to bury. It's all been preserved, notarized, and submitted. Every attempt to misappropriate has been recorded. Every misstep documented. And now, the court has the complete picture. The murmurs swelled, reporters snapping photos, clients gasping, Daniel's lawyers scrambling in real time. His panic, now absolute, had a visible, almost cinematic quality. He reached for the will, trying to argue, to insist, to manipulate the interpretation, but Harold interjected calmly, "Everything you did to suppress this document only strengthens the case against you. Attempting to erase the past is the most visible evidence of intent." Daniel's face went white, realizing that every move he had made, every act of arrogance, every feigned charm, every threat, and every attempt at manipulation had now been documented and corroborated. He was trapped in the procedural cage of his own making, exposed both publicly and legally, and there was no escape. I leaned back, taking a slow sip from the Red's mug, allowing the warmth to steady me, while Daniel stuttered, fumbled, and finally slumped into a chair, defeated and silent for the first time in decades. The restaurant, the clients, the media, the staff, all witnesses, absorbed the scene. Justice had been achieved not through violence or vengeance, but through meticulous preparation, the careful documentation of truth, and an unyielding refusal to be intimidated. It was poetic. The man who had sought to humiliate me, who had threatened my daughter and my life, was undone by patience, intelligence, and procedural rigor. And then I allowed myself to smile, faint but satisfied, as Claire stood beside me, small hand in mine. She whispered, "He can't come after us anymore, right?" I squeezed her hand gently, letting the lesson sink in. "No, sweetheart. Every lie he told, every threat he made, every attempt to manipulate the truth, it's all exposed. And we'll make sure it stays that way." Her eyes shone with relief and quiet admiration. In that moment, I realized that revenge, when executed with precision and morality, could deliver both justice and closure without destroying the integrity of the one who fought for it. Daniel's fall had another layer: public humiliation. News outlets picked up the story within hours, the narrative spreading virally. A man who had publicly humiliated his brother, tried to manipulate family inheritance, and threatened a child was now universally recognized as the villain. Every attempt to spin, to defend, to rationalize his actions was drowned in the overwhelming weight of documented truth. Even those who had once admired him now whispered questions, doubts, and incredulity. His reputation, once polished and untouchable, was now a cautionary tale. Finally, as the evening settled and the last whispers of the crowd faded, I stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, Red's mug in hand, Claire beside me, watching Daniel escorted into a waiting car by his lawyers, a man undone by the very elements he had thought were in his control. The rain-slicked streets reflected the neon glow of the city same city where I had grown up, struggled, and fought to protect what was mine. I whispered quietly, more to the universe than anyone, "Truth is patient. Lies are brittle. And patience turns the smallest detail into the sharpest weapon." The mug, the coffee, the long nights of planning, the quiet observation, all of it coalesced into this moment. Poetic justice served, wounds healed, legacy preserved, and the betrayer humbled. The following morning, the city seemed quieter, as though it too had absorbed Daniel's collapse and paused in reflection. I sipped coffee from the Red's mug at the kitchen table, Claire perched beside me, her school backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes still wide with awe at what she had witnessed. Outside, the faint hum of traffic reminded me that life continued, relentless, ordinary, and yet for us, irrevocably changed. I exhaled slowly, letting the warmth seep through my fingers, appreciating the moment of calm after weeks of meticulous, exhausting strategy. Daniel's empire of deceit had crumbled overnight, and the world, finally, saw the man for who he truly was: manipulative, arrogant, and undone by his own hubris. Harold called mid-morning to confirm that the court had officially accepted all submissions and corroborating evidence. "The judge is impressed," he said, voice calm but tinged with satisfaction. "He'll have no way to spin this. Every misstep, every threat, every fabricated claim, it's all documented and verified. Daniel's luck is exhausted." I smiled faintly, feeling a rare, quiet joy. This wasn't vindictive triumph. It was a measured, deliberate act of justice, one that ensured the integrity of our family's legacy and preserved Claire's trust in fairness, patience, and diligence. By noon, media coverage exploded, and for once, the narrative was controlled without me needing to intervene. Tweets, news articles, and online threads chronicled Daniel's public humiliation and legal exposure. Headlines framed him as the manipulative sibling undone by patience and truth. I watched the story unfold from the living room window, Red's mug warming my hands, and felt a rare surge of vindication mixed with profound relief. He had spent decades believing perception was everything, and now, in a quiet, undeniable symmetry, the truth had proven infinitely stronger than performance. Claire tugged gently at my sleeve. "Dad, is it really over?" I bent to her level, holding her small hands in mine, and said softly, "It is, sweetheart." He tried to take more than was his, tried to twist truth and hurt those we love, but every lie he told, every threat he made, has been exposed. And now he can't touch us. Justice isn't always quick, but it's patient, and it never forgets. Her relief was palpable, her small smile a mirror of the life lessons I had long hoped to instill, that patience, strategy, and integrity ultimately prevail over arrogance, manipulation, and greed. That afternoon, I received the final correspondence from the court. Daniel's attempts to dispute the will and reallocate the inheritance had been denied in full. The notarized amendment in favor of Claire was legally binding. Every contract he had tampered with, every misappropriated sum, every fabricated invoice, all corroborated. The procedural cage had snapped shut, and there was no escaping it. I allowed myself a rare, long breath, the warmth of the coffee mingling with the lingering chill of morning sunlight, and whispered a quiet truth to myself. The smallest detail, preserved and observed, can become the sharpest weapon against the proudest enemy. Weeks later, life slowly returned to routine. Claire's laughter filled the kitchen, mixing with the faint hiss of the coffee machine, while I sat at the counter, Red's mug in hand, reviewing work emails. The daily grind, the pressures of career and bills, the quiet anxiety of modern life, all of it persisted. But a profound sense of closure had settled over me. Daniel, once the orchestrator of humiliation and manipulation, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. My family's legacy, the principles Dad had valued, and Claire's trust in truth had been preserved. In subtle, irreplaceable ways, the rituals I had maintained, the coffee, the documentation, the observation, had become instruments of justice, grounding and sustaining me throughout the ordeal. And yet, the story left its mark on me in other ways. Walking through the city streets one evening, I saw reflections of life's quiet absurdities in storefront windows, the hum of passing traffic, the casual conversations in coffee shops. I thought about Daniel, the arrogance that had blinded him, and the careful patience that had allowed truth to prevail. I smiled faintly, muttering under my breath, "No one builds a house of lies without leaving a crack for light to shine through." In every ripple of reflection, every glance, every small gesture, I carried the satisfaction of hard-won justice and the wisdom that it delivered, that integrity, patience, and meticulous attention to truth are far stronger than ego and manipulation. Claire tugged at my sleeve again, asking for help with homework. I stood, guiding her toward the kitchen table, and glanced back at the Red's mug, still half full, steam rising like a faint reminder of persistence, observation, and quiet resilience. I realized then that revenge, when executed with care and morality, need not corrode the one who seeks it. It could deliver closure, teach lessons, and reinforce the bonds of trust and family. Daniel had been undone not by brute force or impulsive retaliation, but by the patient, precise, and ethically guided hand of someone who refused to accept deceit as truth. As night settled over the city, lights shimmering against wet pavement, I whispered a final thought, both to Claire and to the empty room. Pride falls faster than patience bends, lies crumble under observation, and even the loudest arrogance is silent before the weight of truth. Protect what matters, wait for the evidence, and let justice move in its own perfect time. The Red's mug, the lingering aroma of coffee, the glow of the city, and Claire's calm presence, all of it coalesced into a single, deeply satisfying realization. The betrayer had been destroyed, my family's legacy preserved, and I had emerged not unscathed, but wiser, steadier, and more anchored in the principles that truly mattered. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.